On behalf of the Institute of Nuclear Materials Management, California, Pacific Northwest, and Southwest chapters, and the Stanley Center for Peace and Security, we welcome you to our event, Emerging Digital Technologies for Nonproliferation and Nuclear Security. I'm Ben Lurkey, Program Officer for Nuclear Weapons at the Stanley Center. For those of you who don't know us, the Stanley Center partners with people, organizations, institutions, and governments at all levels to drive policy progress on 3 issue areas: mitigating climate change, avoiding the use of nuclear weapons, and preventing mass violence and atrocities. We believe in inclusive dialogue and diverse perspectives that create better solutions, and for more than 60 years, we've brought together members of the global community to exchange ideas, foster innovation, and take collective action. In our nuclear weapons programming, the Stanley Center works with diverse stakeholders to develop governance solutions that take advantage of emerging technologies and mitigate their potential risks to allow for a safer, more peaceful world that avoids the use of nuclear weapons. We're delighted that you can join us for this event and hear from our 2 featured speakers, Dr. Nidhi Kalra and Dimitri Finker. And we're pleased to take part in continuing the nuclear community's discussions on the opportunities and threats from emerging technologies and on innovation in IAEA safeguards. Some ground rules for today. This is a public event. We have with us more than 500 individuals from 50 countries and 250 organizations. So we welcome you to share what you hear and join the conversation on Twitter via hashtag #NewTechNukeSec and with @StanleyConnect and @INMMTweets. Our discussion this morning begins with featured remarks from Nidhi, then Dimitri. Each speaker will take a few questions after their remarks, and then we'll conclude with 25 minutes of panel discussion and Q&A with both speakers. Our agenda should be displayed to your right. Sessions that feature Q&A will have a Q&A button under the title. Click that button to submit your question for the session that you want it in. You can also go there to upvote questions submitted by other participants if you want to hear them answered. We'll keep the Q&A open throughout the event, so check back often to see what new has come in. We'll try to get to as many as we can. As a reminder, this event is more of a technical discussion, so the best questions will be succinct, directed to one or both speakers, and focused on technical topics, not policy. The organizers are committed to maintaining a safe, welcoming, and productive environment for all participants in this event. By registering for and joining this event, you agree to abide by a respectful behavior policy as developed by INMM. All participants in this event are expected to treat organizers, speakers, and each other with professionalism and respect. Participants are expected to refrain from all harassing behavior toward any individual. Participants who violate that principle will be removed from the event. But if you need any technical help at any point in time during the meeting, there's a tech support questions to the right of the video. Click that and type in your question. My colleague Eleanor will try to keep us connected. I'd now like to introduce our partner and co-host for today's event, Dr. Ruth Kipps. Ruth is president of the INMM California chapter and Deputy Associate Program Leader at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Ruth, good morning. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Ben, for the introduction. And on behalf of my colleagues from the California, Pacific Northwest, and Southwest chapters of the INMM, thank you all for joining us today at this Emerging Digital Technologies webinar. For those of you not familiar with the INMM, the Institute of Nuclear Materials Management is a nonprofit technical organization dedicated to the safe, secure, and effective stewardship of nuclear materials and related technologies. The organization has a worldwide membership of engineers, scientists, policymakers, commercial vendors, educators, and students that come together during the annual meeting and during workshops like this one today to exchange ideas on new concepts, techniques, and equipment for managing nuclear materials. We all realize now more than ever that digital technologies are driving change and are enhancing human capabilities. Practical applications of emerging digital technologies are likely to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of nuclear safeguards and nuclear security operations. However, it is our understanding that proven industry methods and emerging technologies have not been fully explored in their potential to the nuclear materials management community. At the same time, the nuclear materials management community continues to work with ever-restricting budgets and resources. And to address this challenge, we as an organization and community need to bring together experts in historically non-nuclear information and digital technology professions and the more traditional nuclear technology fields. And it is in this context that the California, Pacific Northwest, and Southwest chapters of the INMM teamed up with the Stanley Center and organized a workshop that aims to take a closer look at technologies that might be able to solve ongoing and future challenges in nuclear materials management. Due to the pandemic, the in-person workshop will now take place in the spring or summer of 2021. More details to follow, but it will be hosted at Lawrence Livermore National Lab in California, where groundbreaking research is carried out in this field and where new technology is further commercialized in Silicon Valley and the larger San Francisco Bay Area. The format of the workshop will include technology demonstrations as well as panel discussions on the policy, legal, and ethical implications of the use of emerging digital technologies. And while we continue to plan for this in-person event, we're delighted to offer you this webinar today that aims to set the stage for discussions next year. We have two excellent speakers with us, Nidhi from RAND and Dimitri Finker from the IAEA, who will each offer their unique perspective on the opportunities and challenges that come with the use of emerging digital technologies in nuclear security and non-proliferation. So without any further ado, I will turn it back over to my colleague from the Stanley Center, who will welcome and introduce our speakers. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Ruth. I have the pleasure of introducing our first featured speaker, Dr. Nidhi Kalra. Nidhi is a senior information scientist at the RAND Corporation. She's previously served as director of RAND's San Francisco Bay Area office and co-director of RAND's Center for Decision-Making Under Uncertainty. Her research focuses on autonomous vehicle policy, climate change adaptation, and tools and methods that help people and organizations make better decisions amid uncertainty. She previously served as Senior Technology Policy Advisor to Senator Kamala Harris and as a Senior Decision Scientist at the Office of the Chief Economist of Sustainable Development at the World Bank. She received her PhD in robotics from Carnegie Mellon University's Robotics Institute. Welcome to the webinar, Dr. Nidhi Kalra. Nidhi, good morning. Over to you.
I'm great, thanks. How are you? All right, well, let me share my screen. Great, let me know, does this work? Okay, I'm gonna assume it does. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are. Today, I wanna talk to you about how we might deal with opportunities and threats emerging from new technology. And the TLDR, the too long didn't read, of my presentation today is first that taking advantage of new technologies requires grappling with deep uncertainty. And I will explain what deep uncertainty is. And in the face of deep uncertainty, unfortunately, our old ways of decision-making often don't serve us very well. They will lead us astray. And I want to introduce you to decision-making under deep uncertainty, a class of methodologies that can help us make good decisions without first needing to make good predictions. Let me start, though, by leading us through some of the challenges and opportunities of new technologies. Let me begin with artificial intelligence, this broad field that is fundamentally the simulation of human intelligence in machines. Now, artificial intelligence isn't new. It's been, a topic that has been studied for decades. But I think in the last 10 to 15 years, it has reached new capabilities, which is the development of new algorithms coupled with enormous computing power. And machine learning is a subset of AI. So often people are confused about the relationship between AI and machine learning. It's a subset of AI in which machines learn and improve through experience. And there are applications of AI in essentially every sector. So these graphics at the bottom below, in the lower left, we're talking about face recognition. It's probably one of the most familiar applications of AI, where computers match one image to another for identification, for verifying, is this person this other person, or even to say, what expression is this face showing? What is the affect here? And that is often a combination of a machine learning algorithm and a broader kind of artificial intelligence. There's also AI in supply chain management, from things like more efficient routing to demand forecasting, managing supply chain equipment for efficiency and longevity. And of course, the military applications are tremendous. There's automatic target detection, identifying terrorist activity. No matter where you look in today's world, we're going to find applications of artificial intelligence. And there are countless concerns, beginning with simple things like, is it accurate? Is the artificial intelligence technology learning or doing what it is supposed to be doing? Can we understand it? Is it behaving fairly or is it biased? One of the questions we asked ourselves at RAND was, how might AI affect the risk of nuclear war? And I'm going to show a little video developed after a workshop we held on this very issue. So this was a workshop we had to consider what could happen to nuclear security amid competing nation states that have different applications of artificial intelligence. What will they know about their own capabilities? What will this do to affect their perceptions of security, their perceptions of other countries' capabilities? Of course, we didn't come to definitive answers, but I thought that this example highlighted some of the really complex ways in which advanced technology can affect something that we've been working on internationally for decades. And really, what does a precarious nuclear balance look like? Let me further then discuss another application of artificial intelligence, which is autonomous vehicles, an area that I work in quite a bit. Autonomous vehicles are, as many of you know, transforming transportation. These are vehicles that can drive themselves some or all of the time. And they include passenger, transit, freight, industrial vehicles. Essentially, there's an application for autonomy in almost anything with wheels and rail and other forms, drones, other forms of transportation. To give you a sense of how fast this area is moving, the state of California requires companies that are testing autonomous vehicles to register. And there are at least 65 different companies registered to test autonomous vehicles in California alone. And in fact, until recently, you could go to Las Vegas and hail a driverless car and to take you up and down the strip. So this is no longer the science fiction it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. It is very much a reality. Some of us have self-driving capabilities in our own vehicles. But the threats and opportunities abound. There are questions around how self-driving vehicles will shape safety. Will they make our roads safer or less safe? Congestion, will we have more road congestion, or will we have less because the vehicles are more efficient? What about sustainability? If these are technologies that can be electrified, will we have a much more sustainable transportation system? Or will they increase transportation demand so much that in fact we put many more cars on the road, we have many more dead miles on the road? What about social inequality? Are self-driving vehicles going to be technologies that allow people who otherwise didn't have access to vehicles, allow them access to better transportation, or will these be essentially toys for the already very wealthy? And these are questions that we don't have answers to because they look deep into the future. At RAND, we asked a particular question that is on the minds of developers and the public and policymakers, which is how safe should autonomous vehicles be before they are allowed on the road for consumer use? Do they need to be just better than the average driver? Should they be nearly perfect? And the answers depend on a lot of complex questions. First, of course, is when will they be truly commercially available? How fast will they be adopted and who will start using them? How safe and secure will each individual autonomous vehicle be? How will the rest of the transportation system respond to their introduction? And what kinds of, how will they affect other sectors? And what kinds of risks will the public accept? So these questions are not easy to answer. And in fact, they're representative of what it means to look at emerging technologies and think about their impact. Harnessing opportunities and managing threats of emerging technologies requires confronting deep uncertainty. Deep uncertainty occurs when the parties to a decision either don't know or don't agree on the following questions. First is, how will trends unfold in the future? What is the likelihood of a particular trend occurring this way versus that way? Second, how do those trends interact? Essentially, if we were to model them, do we know how they interface with each other? Do they know how they affect each other? How does transportation demand affect autonomy? How does autonomy affect transportation demand? And finally, how do we value the outcomes? Even if we can agree on what the future will hold and how trends will unfold, different people will have different values about what the results are. And the consequence of deep uncertainty is that our old or traditional ways of thinking about these problems don't serve us very well. A traditional approach is to think about how we could make better predictions. Can we reduce our uncertainty? So a predictive planning approach, which may be familiar to many of you, begins by the parties to a decision agreeing on future conditions, saying, well, let's do our best to predict what will happen. Then we'll identify our optimal strategy amid our predictions, and then we will conduct perhaps a sensitivity analysis to say, is our decision really sensitive to what our assumptions have been? This kind of planning works well when we can agree on those future conditions, when we can begin by having a good idea of how things work. Unfortunately, the real world, as you know, is almost never like this. For most real policy problems, the future is deeply uncertain. Stakeholders don't agree on what it will look like or how our policy options will perform in that future. And so when applied to real world problems, traditional approaches lead to gridlock. When stakeholders can't agree on the assumptions that drive a decision, it will be very difficult to get them to think about their choices. The second is that this kind of planning can often lead to brittle solutions, because when the future unfolds differently than was predicted, the chosen strategy often fails. And so the strategies that were selected tend to be very vulnerable to those sets of assumptions. Worse still, these kinds of approaches encourage stakeholders to advocate for assumptions that they know will lead to the policy choices they already prefer. So if you know that a particular assumption will lead to your preferred outcome, a person may be inclined to advocate for those assumptions, in particular to achieve those very outcomes they hope will come true. So in sum, predictive planning encourages the kinds of cognitive biases that really stymie collaborative evidence-based decision-making when they're used in the presence of deep uncertainty. But this is not news to many people, and this is where scenario planning was developed. It isn't new, but it's used increasingly to grapple with deep uncertainty. People recognize that it's very hard to make predictions about how technologies or anything will come to pass. So scenario planning involves often crafting 4 to 6 scenarios that tend to be very diverse and evaluating choices in each scenario. What would we do in this world compared to that world? But where scenario planning falls short, and you may have experienced this in scenario planning exercises, is that while they engage our imagination, they often don't help us to make decisions about the near term because we don't know which scenario will come to pass. And so this is an imaginative exercise. It brings people together around different narratives, but when the rubber meets the road, it's very hard to know what should we do. And so often scenario planning doesn't help us make choices. This is where decision-making under deep uncertainty comes in. It's a class of methodologies that use the analytics differently, not to understand the future, but to focus on the merits of our choices by asking a different set of questions, by saying, what are the conditions that would affect how a plan or a strategy performs? Under what conditions would our plan fail to meet our various goals? What could happen to lead this plan astray? And are those conditions sufficiently plausible that we should improve upon our plan or that we should hedge? And finally, what choices do we have to make now, and which ones can we safely defer? This is not one approach, but it's a different way of thinking about problems that we face by focusing our attention on choices rather than on predictions. In sum, decision-making under deep uncertainty helps make good decisions without first needing to make predictions. So we used decision-making under deep uncertainty methodologies, in particular an approach called robust decision-making, to ask the question I raised earlier, which is how safe should autonomous vehicles be before they're allowed on the road for consumer use? I'm going to try to show a video that hopefully illustrates this. Here we go.
The main argument for mass deployment of autonomous vehicles is the number of lives that could be saved. But how do you put a number on that when the outcome is affected by so many variables? Some say that AVs must be nearly perfect before we deploy, because imperfect technology would cost lives. Others point out that human drivers are far from perfect, that over 30,000 people a year already die on America's roads, almost all due to human error. So we should get AVs on the road as soon as they drive better than we do. So which plan is safer? To find out, we have to project future road fatalities if AVs were never introduced. Next, we estimate how quickly developers can improve AVs after they've been introduced and how quickly conventional vehicles get replaced. Now we can estimate the lives saved under two scenarios: nearly perfect AVs and ones that are just better than the average driver. If nearly perfect AVs prevent 29,000 of 30,000 annual deaths, it's a no-brainer to put them on the road. But when does that happen? How long have you waited for them to be perfected? And how many people have died in the meantime? It turns out that introducing AVs when they are less than perfect, when they're merely better than the average human driver, may actually save more lives in the long run, because we're introducing them sooner. We're not waiting. As a result, they get safer, faster. Once they're on the road, developers would have more data to improve them than they do with their small test fleets. The technology improves more rapidly, more people replace their old cars sooner, and still more lives can be saved. In fact, under every combination of future adoption and performance conditions we examined, introducing AVs when they're less than perfect led to fewer cumulative road fatalities over a 30-year period. In some cases, saving hundreds of thousands of lives. While postponing the introduction of AVs until they're nearly perfect might seem safer in the short term, it could ultimately be the more dangerous choice. But are we really ready to let go of the steering wheel? We have to ask ourselves, what puts us at greater risk? Imperfect machines or imperfect human beings? And if we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good, we must consider the critical factor of time.
So that is a high-level look at what we actually did. So let me take you under the hood. To answer this question of how safe is safe enough, we developed and ran a model of safety that when we ran it hundreds of times under different futures. So there's so many factors of how driving will change and how safety will evolve. We ran this model hundreds of times under different combinations of assumptions. And we analyzed the results to answer key questions about each policy. Note, not to answer questions about the future, but about what we can do about it. So we looked at two policies. Should we introduce just when their autonomous vehicles are just safer than the average driver, or shall we wait for them to be nearly perfect? And we answered the questions I raised earlier. The first is, under what conditions are more lives saved by each policy, and how much are those savings? What we found is that a policy of just safer than average could save hundreds of thousands more lives over time than waiting for perfection. Waiting for perfection is only better if the wait is short and AVs induce transportation demand, meaning that while we would be waiting, the demand for transportation would be so high that more people would die on our roads with imperfect autonomous vehicles. So this is where decision-making under deep uncertainty tells us the conditions under which each policy performs well and when each policy does not. The second question is, what does the evidence suggest about those conditions? And using essentially a sort of a subjective judgment, what we determined is that the wait for perfection is going to be long, and that AVs may not induce transportation demand that much. And therefore, the conditions under which we should wait for perfection are not very likely to occur. And what does this imply for policies governing the introduction of autonomous vehicles for consumer use? Essentially, that's the title of our talk, which is "Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good." That policymakers and the public should understand that that waiting for nearly perfect AVs so that we can satisfy our appetite or our need for perfection from machines may cost us in the long run. Now, what is the relevance to nuclear material management? There's at least a few things. First is that self-driving may have a role in nuclear material management in transportation, whether it's by drones or self-driving vehicles. You know, it's the adage in robotics is dull, dirty, and dangerous. These are the conditions in which you want a robot doing your work. There's also issues in self-driving that arise, I believe, in nuclear material management, including, for example, safety and data security, risk of terrorism, for instance. And of course, there are opportunities and threats from these new technologies in all kinds of sectors that are fraught with deep uncertainty. You know, with nuclear materials, we're talking about long material lifetimes, enormous consequences if things go awry, and often intractable debates about what acceptable risk actually looks like. So my hope is that these ideas of decision-making under deep uncertainty are applicable to a wide range of issues in the nuclear material management community. So bring it back full circle. I would suggest that taking advantage of new technologies really does require grappling with deep uncertainties about the future, about outcomes, and our old ways of decision-making may not serve us very well. Decision-making under deep uncertainty can help us make good decisions without predictions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nidhi. That was great. Really enjoyed the overview of the process of that kind of decision-making and the example from autonomous vehicles. We're going to get to a few questions from the Q&A, which seems like it's simmering along well right now. As a reminder, if you want to join the Q&A and give us a question, off to your right, you should see a button next to this session that says Q&A. Click there, give us your questions, maybe upvote some. I'm upvoting some so that I get to help bias the conversation. I wanted to start with a quick question off the bat. Your talk centered on helping organizations find solutions that work well if the predicted future doesn't come to pass. 2020 has been unkind to many plans and predictions. For technical organizations in the middle of a year that's turbulent like this one, what does a robust decision-making process feel like these days? Is it dynamic? Is it steady, chaotic? And kind of relatedly, what would a traditional assumptions-based process feel like these days?
Yeah, it's, you know, often it hinges on whether the assumptions that drive our decision are implicit or whether we can make them explicit, and whether we can say, look, this plan will work as long as the following 5 things hold. And here's what happens if these load-bearing assumptions fall apart. And so I think at this time, in this global, these global conditions, people are starting by grappling with, how do we not have any idea something like this could happen? You know, the public health community has been talking about pandemics for decades. They have been preparing, sadly, for this moment, and yet we are still caught by surprise. I think fundamentally, decision-making under deep uncertainty is about a certain kind of humility that says we do not know what is going to happen. And we need to be ready for all of the things we thought were going to be true to not be true. And that is a chaotic process that is difficult to organize, but it starts by making assumptions explicit.
Great, thanks. A question from the queue. Does the responsibility for managing the potential consequences of deploying emerging technologies lie with developers, users, or both?
That depends on the technology. I'm sorry, it's always a depends answer. I tend to suggest it depends, that it lays with the developer. That often especially if we're talking about, government related developers, right? If we're talking about, we're not talking about commercial developers, that the public uses a technology, how an individual uses, for example, social media is an individual choice. But so many of the technologies we have today are so beyond the control, the understanding, they interact in really complex ways that it really is on the developer to anticipate some of the unintended consequences and to manage them when they emerge.
Thanks. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. I'm seeing one from the queue that's getting a lot of upvotes. Is accessing more data always better?
No. As we get more computation power, there's a tendency to want to make our models and data better and better and better. And I would say that often that doesn't help us. Because if we have, let's say, computational cycles, if we have mental bandwidth, let's ask different questions about our problem rather than trying to get better and better at making predictions. So for example, if I have one more computational run of a model that I can do, if I have more computational power that's opened up, I want to use it not to make a better model, but to use it to understand my problem better.
That's interesting. So the approach that you outlined earlier talks a lot about decisions under deep uncertainty. It sounds more responsive and kind of discourse-based. How much of the success of that approach is attributed to the process itself, or how much might be attributed to an organization having a culture that facilitates discussion and incorporates a lot of different views?
It's both. Part of it is the analytics. It's a different kind of using your analytics differently. Part of it is that organizations, particularly organizations that have a political interface, are not often very welcoming to uncertainty, right? People want to know, what should I do and why should I do it and what's this going to result in? Having an organization that has the capacity to grapple with the unknown and accept that our choices are not foregone conclusions, but are gambles, I think is essential to thinking about deep uncertainty and to managing it, because we can't solve problems we're not willing to acknowledge. We can't manage uncertainty if we're not willing to accept that it's there.
Important point. Another question from the queue. Ooh, I get to make choices on which one I give you. So at the top of your remarks, you mentioned the dull, dirty, and dangerous work that defines what robots do. How about when you want to limit access to sensitive information? That is, can a robot assure a party being inspected in a nuclear monitoring regime that other intelligence information is not being siphoned off during the robot's monitoring task?
That sounds to me like a data security problem, perhaps more than a robotics problem. And all of the challenges of data security apply here. Can it happen? Can such a system be developed? Probably. But the challenge is always trying to provide a certain degree of data with, essentially, to give someone data, you are opening the doors to information, right? And the question becomes, how do you make sure someone is not entering through that same door when you're not looking, right? It's otherwise we would just make data fortresses where nothing is allowed to exit. And this to me is, as I say, a data security problem. And in theory, yes, it can be done. But if we look at what has happened in our world, even the most theoretically secure air-gapped systems can be penetrated. So I'm not optimistic that that can be thoroughly prevented.
You've got a lot of company on that point. All right, thank you for the short Q&A. Nidhi, we'll see you here in a bit after Dimitri's presentation for a panel discussion with all 3 of us. So thanks.
Thank you.
It's now my pleasure to introduce our next featured speaker, Mr. Dimitri Finker from the International Atomic Energy Agency. Dimitri is a technology foresight specialist with the IAEA, where within the Division of Scientific and Technical Services, he is responsible for the Technology Foresight Program that has the goal of developing and authorizing non-traditional instruments used for safeguards verification. Finker has been involved in the development of innovation for instrumentation and control systems used in power reactors, as well as new instruments for homeland security and nonproliferation. He also founded a startup in the field of electric vehicles and energy storage. Dimitri holds a diploma in engineering, physics of plasma and optoelectronics, as well as an MBA. As a reminder, the Q&A for Dimitri's talk is already open. So if you want to submit a question for him, go ahead and click that button right next to his session, pose your question and upvote. And with that, Dimitri, good afternoon and welcome to the program.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. Thank you for the introduction. My video just disappeared, which is maybe okay. Let me start my video again. Yes, I'm still here. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. And indeed, I'm leading the Technology Foresight group within IAEA Safeguards. This is a small group of engineering work that was created about 7 years ago. And the initial goal was to build new instruments that can facilitate the work of safeguard inspectors. So the traditional core expertise, technical expertise of IAEA Safeguard falls in very specific areas, such as radiation measurement, containment, surveillance. But in reality, the work of inspectors in the field requires to handle and operate varieties of different instruments that might not fall squarely into any of those compartments. So the problem that we're facing with Technology Foresight was very generic. We were trying to focus on non-traditional instrumentation, whatever they are, contribute to make field activities more efficient, which means making the same as we do today, but with less resource, looking at productivity, making a field activity more effective, which is make better measurements, doing more with our current resource. And there was a feeling that there was a lot of things happening in the world outside safeguards that could be useful. And we were not necessarily very well equipped in a very narrow field of safeguard expertise to take advantage of them. So far, the agency had taken I would say, cautious path to instrument innovation. Sometimes it has been slow. The project could be completed. The requirements might become obsolete by the time the project would be complete. The instrument would be very custom made, very expensive to make. So my goal here, as I understood, was to hunt for new innovation, new technological opportunities, not develop for us, but for the customers, adapt them for us, and bring them back in the realm of IAEA Safeguard. So let's try to understand first why innovation can be slow, sometimes expensive, and always difficult. First, there is a kind of tension of contradiction between running a large organization that is risk adverse and conservative. And it's not specific to IAEA, and it's not a negative statement. Agency has to be, it is mission to be conservative. You don't want to draw safeguard conclusion and be uncertain or being inconsistent. But when you have this mission statement, this, I would say, DNA built in, and when you try to innovate, which is, as we were reminded just previously, dealing with uncertainty, with risk and change, there is a strong tension. The second reason is this silo of expertise that is built inside the organization. So we have NDA, instrumentation, we got radiation measurements, we got surveillance, we got containment. So what happens when we have a problem that do not really fit into this organization? And we have, I don't know, GPS, infrared measurement, visual observation, or what I would call enabling technology, which are kind of being useful without being an instrument in itself. So that are a bit like the orphan technologies where everyone deals with them, but no one is really specialized. And then there is a very specific layer of complexity specific to IAEA safeguards, which requires to develop very specialized scientific instruments. So very niche instruments that we might be the only person to use in the world. To produce them in a very small series, because we have a few hundred inspectors. So the maximum of the number of batch of production of a handheld equipment would be about 100. They need to be also operated by non-specialists. Inspectors are heavily trained to become better inspectors, but they are not only trained to operate each instrument. So we need to be able to give them instruments, train them quickly, and they're not here to make measurements. It's our job as GTS, as technical and scientific support. It's not really the main mission of an inspector. So you see, scientific, very specialized, small series, and easy to use, it's difficult. And if you compare our resource to, let's say, Apple, we have, that has more than 800 staff working just on the camera of iPhone. 800 is about the whole headcount of safeguards, right? So we are trying to build, it's a very difficult mission. So there is a different way of approaching this. First, traditionally, we can plan top-down, a waterfall approach, and write detailed requirements, launch development work based on these requirements. And what you want to do when you do that is remove uncertainty from the start. And you want to show that you carefully plan, that you can budget, and that relies on the assumption that I know what I need, I understand the problem, and I just need to develop a solution. It's just an engineering problem. And it might be very appropriate when you want to do incremental innovation, when, let's say, you have operational experience with a device and you know you could improve it by having a better sensor, a faster computer, then you are in good shape. But when you start for something that is more uncertain, less defined, maybe very fuzzy, it's a very sure way to nip any creative solution from the bud. So then there is another way, non-traditional, that is to work like a startup. And based on my background, this is, and based on my understanding of what I needed, that's, I would say, the main way I'm working today. So I don't have a startup, but I will work as an intrapreneur. That means I'm a small entrepreneur inside a large organization. So that means we need to embrace uncertainty. We need to admit that we don't understand so well the market needs. I know my customers, they are inspectors, they're easy to reach, but do they know what they need? Do I understand what they want? Not necessarily. And my work is to work to define a problem, to understand what they need. And the main outcome of my work is actually not anymore to develop a product, but the main outcome of my work is to start understanding what is needed. So let me share my screen to show you a few things. So you can see here, indeed, that's what I said. We have the traditional way, top-down, waterfall, that is linear. But why do we want actually to have a more complicated path that requires iteration? One of the reasons is that's because that's how innovation works, radical innovation. It's not a linear process. You might have an initial understanding of the problem, but very often it's wrong. And in any case, it's incomplete. And the solution that we have envisioned at the start of the project might fail or might be different. So if you start with a predefined, crystallized idea of what is needed, this means that any change you make in the project can be seen as a failure. And what you do with failure, usually you try to bury them into a PowerPoint, and show that through a careful planning and roadmap, actually things went really smoothly. And this kind of PowerPoints showing roadmaps, usually good stories you can tell after the fact, but it's very rarely what happened during the project. If you embrace from the start uncertainty, if you keep agile, flexible, and you keep questioning yourself, you keep an open mind to the needs, to the problem, and to the solution, then actually you might be discovering new things, and it becomes a learning opportunity. So this is, I would say, the mantra of startup is fail early, fail small, and fail safe, because you try to minimize the cost of a uncertainty or of a mistake. The second thing is, why do we want to work like a startup? Is because we want to focus on understanding the problem and not on the technology. We want to become, I would say, technology agnostic. So there are specific management projects, project management techniques that we use to avoid becoming too technology focused, technology centric, which is very difficult for experts or for engineers. For instance, we do not write requirements because requirements qualify what the product shall fulfill, but we try to write user scenarios, non-technical stories that describe from the user point of view what's going to happen, and that describe what the user would like to do. So it forces us to work from the start with the end user, in our case, inspectors, and create a better understanding of what they would like, what they do not want. And it has a side effect, which is it engages them early in the projects, which means it creates a pool of early adopters that might facilitate the transition when the project is over, which is actually one of the most difficult parts of innovation. Is once the project works, how do you get it out, right, and get it adopted? So when we say that, actually, you find out that technology foresight is a complete misnomer, because we're not dealing with technologies, we're dealing with problems. And we're not talking about foresight or future, but I want to implement presently as soon as possible. So, and then like a startup, actually, you want to be very thrifty with your resource. So you want to create a big impact with little resource. And if you don't do it, you might just be shut down. So you need to pick your battle wisely. You need to pick the project that can have an impact. You don't want to have too much overhead, so you don't want to plan 90% of the time. You want to start implementing as soon as possible and get products out in the hands of inspectors. So when you look at impact and the type of innovation, there are different categories. First, you can wait for new scientific discoveries. And if you're lucky, it will have a great impact, but it will also take a lot of effort. And if you're unlucky, after a long time, you would see it actually doesn't work. So you waited, you spend a lot of resource, and you have no impact. So then there is another way, which is to take product that already exists and just move them inside the agency, which is very often a very trivial problem. So it's, I would say, it's not the core of my business. I would say the core of the focus of technology foresight is to adapt technologies to safeguard scenarios. And this is really where you can get a strong impact with a minimum amount of efforts. So let me illustrate through, I would say, an example of the kind of work we have performed in the last year. So this example deals with the verification of spent fuel. Inspectors have been using for the last 30 years a very simple, very efficient instrument that is called the ICVD, a serial curve viewing device. And what you can see on this picture is an inspector pointing down the instrument to look at spent fuel through 10 meters of water from a bridge. And what this instrument makes is very easy. It just filters the ambient light, get the UV, amplifies it, and allow the inspector to indirectly confirm the presence or the absence of spent fuel items stored underwater. So it's a very good instrument in the way that it is rugged, it's easy to use, it has been around for 30 years. The disadvantage of this instrument is that it doesn't record, that it relies purely on the judgment of inspectors. And if you got a problem, it might take several visits to solve, and you don't really measure here, you observe. So big scientific progress have usually been made when we start measuring something and we stop observing. So there was an idea floating for many years, which was to take pictures through this instrument, and that sounds like a good idea. So initial project was, let's find a camera we can put behind the eyepiece. So that's what the plan. Have you tried ever to take an image through binoculars or through a telescope? And it's very disappointing. You have a dark, noisy, blurry image, and that's exactly what was the case here. So we took this problem and we rescoped it completely different through image and data processing. So we put online what we called a technology challenge. We provided data through, I would say, internet, using the public information office, social media run by the agency, to, I would say, gather the crowds, get people trying to improve the image, and we get amazing results, as you can see. So the image on the left, it's the original image, and after doing some stacking, some image processing, you get a much better image that is better resolved, less noise, and get a lot more sensitivity. So here, instead of writing a statement of work, starting with requirements and meant only for a tiny world of safeguards specific experts, we really expose the problem to a vast crowd, non-specialists, and we managed to work with people that had never worked with the agency before. We had astronomers, we had people doing drone image recognition, and that was actually the people who got the best results. So in 2 months, we managed to get this image. So it was very promising. We launched the project, we built a new instrument, and 2 years later, we got this real-time image processing improvements. And you see, it was hard work. 2 years of work to develop the software, because having the proof of concept, but make it is something, but make it work as a real-time improvement that can be used by inspectors is actually the core of the work here. And the problem actually was expanded, because once we had to run that in real time, we had to build an entire new platform, hardware platform. So just the camera became actually a very powerful, high-speed real-time processor, and we had to consider the ergonomy of the instruments. So the project was completely different, starting from a very simple image processing software to rebuilding, redesigning the optics and the processing of the entire instruments. So now that the first step, it worked very well the first time. We run this technology foresight challenge, and we run another challenge, because now that we can record image, we had the idea that we could, so that the results actually we get with instruments, we had the idea we could put it on a robot. So floating robots, and here we're talking about efficiency. Instead of having the inspector looking at each spent fuel one by one, and you might have thousands of them in a spent fuel pound. The idea was to put that inside the robot that would be autonomously measuring row by row the intensity of the fuel assembly. So that was the second challenge. And as I'm speaking, we're actually building a prototype of this robot. One has been already deployed in a power plant, and maybe in 1 or 2 years, that will become a new authorized instrument. So that's the goal. So let me summarize to say what we have done here. So in order to bring disruptive innovation inside safeguards instrumentation, first, we spent most of our time defining a problem. We're trying to explain what we want to achieve, explaining why, and focusing on our evaluation criteria. What we try not to do is to over-specify, write requirements, say how the solution should be implemented. And this leaves room for creativity. And that's where I would say real innovation comes. We have to listen to people. We've got to listen to experts of different fields and get their idea. The second thing we've done here is to reach out outside the usual circle working for safeguards. So it's a very good way to remain relevant, I would say, for safeguard instrumentation. One of the most effective tools we use, not the only one, is to launch crowdsourcing challenge that allowed us to team up with people who had never worked with safeguard before. I mentioned astronomers, we've got startups, robotic startup, drone engineers, and so forth. And the last point is we focused on implementing. For me, the core of innovation is implementation. And I spend 1% of my time getting ideas. Good ideas are everywhere. What you need to do is to listen and to test them and have a workflow to allow you to quickly evaluate and discard bad ideas to the ones that are achievable and implement. And engage inspectors, engage the operator, engage the member states. That's the core of this cooperative effort. So you can see that the main objective of technology foresight is, as we said, to build new instruments and make inspections more efficient and more effective. But there are some side effects to that. One of them has been to create a new workflow to procure new technologies. And this has been a very successful way of communicating with the stakeholders and engaging in safeguard efforts. And I think it's very beneficial to our global mission to improve nuclear safeguards that goes just beyond instrument developments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dimitri. That was a great overview. The Q&A is going nicely right now. There's still time to add a couple questions either for the short Q&A with Dimitri or for the longer Q&A in which Nidhi will also participate. But right now we've got a heavily upvoted one that is, in this environment of fast-paced advancement in new technologies, how can international organizations such as the IAEA implement and adopt emerging tech before they're overtaken by new innovations or become obsolete, especially when international communities, such as those implementing international safeguards or nuclear security, are hesitant to taking risks?
Yeah, I think I would say there is a lot of hype in technology, and the fact that we are maybe more conservative doesn't mean we're not going to adopt the latest technology, but we are very careful not to adopt a technology that will disappear too quickly. So that means we need to get an evaluation workflow early on to spend more time testing technologies and not jump on the first idea. I would say, our life cycle, the way we develop the project is actually because of our source, but not because of that only, because the nature of the problem we're trying to solve for safeguards doesn't mean we're going to solve problem in 6 months. Once we identify a problem, when you identify technology, we need a couple of years, usually, to authorize the instruments, to verify that it's going to be useful for the operator, useful for the inspector. So that kind of inertia, I would say, is actually beneficial to us, because we don't want to change too often. We don't want to jump on the latest technology. We want to have something that can be adopted and stays with the agency long enough so it can be adopted.
Thanks. Kind of leading into that a little bit. Another question from the queue. What are some of the normal problems you've encountered in implementing some of these tools, be it from member state approvals or problems from other sources?
Yeah, that's true. That's the safeguard environment is very, very specific. So we got one of the issue we have is sometimes availability of representative data. So the data that we capture in the field is safeguard confidential, is not always accessible to me, even less to my suppliers. So creating a set of reliable data that is representative can be a challenge and can delay some of the projects or complexify tremendously. That's usually you got way around it. You can create your own set of data, but you can also try to generalize the problem to a higher level that will, I would say, anonymize the data you are dealing with. So that's one set. The other challenge we have is testing, field testing. And of course, we're dealing with very special environments, nuclear environments, very sensitive areas. And we are definitely listening to member states and operators. So that's where working very early with the member state to explain what we're trying to do is really the way to do. And training has been a fantastic tool for that, because training usually is a bit more open for experimentation. And sometimes, most of the time, takes place in real places. So that definitely requires me to take that into account very early inside the project workflow. That means 1 year ahead of time, I start planning, or 2 years ahead of time, I start laying a request saying, we might have a robot to deploy. Would you be interested? And the most difficult one is usually the first implementation. When it works, it goes a bit faster. But you will be surprised that this problem is actually much less acute than you could expect. If you formulate properly, if you explain carefully what you need to do and why, and you have a good, solid engineering explanation, safety requirements, usually it goes through quite well. And the last point that is very complicated is data confidentiality, because there is a layer for most of the safeguard instruments that are staying inside the sites, that the information needs to be authenticated at the source, encrypted to according to certain standards. So if you start putting too many constraints at the start of the project, you never go anywhere. And that's where, like a startup owner, also you need to ignore sometimes some of the constraints. You need to have a leap of faith saying, I will solve that later. And you need first to get a first prototype that might not have all the best feature for authentication, all the best feature for encryption, but usually a way around is to give it to an inspector, leave it under custody, and you might reduce the amount. Then if you want to put the instrument inside, I would say, an unattended system, then you're gone for like 1-2 more years of testing, evaluation. But you shouldn't do that at the start. I think you should do that when the concept works. The instrument has been adopted already by some inspectors, and that's the next layer. So don't forget some of the constraints, keep them in the back of your mind, but don't try to integrate everything from the start.
That's really helpful perspective. I think we have a chance for one more question from the queue before we go to panel. I think it actually flows nicely in what you just said about how you're adjusting your workflows. There's been a lot of discussion out there on the potential for blockchain uses and safeguards, including at things like the fantastic workshops that the agency has been hosting on emerging technologies. I wonder if you could kind of situate that discussion within the workflow that you're developing for kind of exploring those technologies. What are where is that in the timeline? What kind of hurdles does that discussion face ahead?
Which technology, sorry, I was just skipping.
On uses of distributed ledger technologies for safeguards information management.
All right, here I might give a disappointing answer, because I must say it's slightly outside the scope of my work, and I see a lot of potential for that, I must say. But I'm still expecting to see a very precise case where it could be used. So there is a lot of potential for that. There is no question. But there are so many cases. We need to select first one that is going to be, I would say, a success story. And that's really I would say, where you need to have a good instinct about how to pick the first example that might work. You don't try to address every case, because it requires too many change of infrastructures. You know, if you try to get all the declaration using this technology, that requires changing the whole workflow of member states inside the agency. You're touching the infrastructure of information. It's tough. So you don't want to start with the most difficult case. You want to start with an easier one. And I think one possible example would be, to have like a single instrument that can have a used by the operator and also by the agency, to try to provide some authentication by another method. So here the real work would be, and I'm still expecting to see something, would be to pick the right success story to start. I don't know which one yet.
That's great. Thanks for discussing that example. We're now going to shift into a full panel with me, Dimitri, and Nidhi. We'll give a chance for all the videos to come together and the transitions to work their magic. Hi, Nidhi. Good to see you. Been a little bit. So while we're waiting for the full Q&A to populate a little bit, and for anybody watching, you can still click that last Q&A button in the agenda to submit questions there. We'll try to get to as many as we can. I want to give the two of you a chance to talk to one another, given the different issues that you've presented. But I kind of wanted to situate that conversation a little bit in the kind of rapid pace of technology advancement. An assessment that I have is that the difference in pace between technology advancement and organizations' consideration of new technology feels like it's widening. So Nidhi, starting with you, and then Dimitri, feel free to reflect on this. Nidhi, given what you know of the non-proliferation and nuclear security community and what we've just talked about, what advice do you have for organizations who are trying to close that pace gap and better take advantages of technologies coming online?
This might be an unorthodox response, but let me start by saying it's incredibly hard to do. I live in San Francisco, right next to Silicon Valley, and we often see people point fingers and say, why can't we be more like Silicon Valley? And what people often forget is that companies in Silicon Valley fail a lot. And when we're talking about nuclear security, nuclear non-proliferation, materials, failure seems to be like a bit less of an option. And so when we're talking about, this idea of move fast and break things, that's the ethos around here. That is one way to keep up with technology, is being very, very willing to make mistakes, to crash into walls, essentially. So I think I would start by saying, let's be realistic about the kinds of risks an organization in this field can afford to take, and be judicious about what keeping up looks like and what it costs, because keeping up for its own sake, I don't think has merit. I think it starts by recognizing that not every sector can act like Silicon Valley, and to understand what the responsibilities are to being cautious. That may not be a popular view, but that's my take on it.
I see Dimitri nodding as you were saying. Dimitri?
Oh, no, that's completely true. I mean, if the agency were we're jumping on every new technologies, the rate of failure would be extremely high, and this is not what we want. So one way to deal with that is actually, I think the agency had a very good concept here with this technology foresight group, was to see us as a kind of sandbox. So my goal here is to take high risk, high uncertainty projects, work with them the best way I can, and isolate safeguard operations, safeguards, I would say normal work from this high risk. And what comes out of my project is, I would say, standard traditional projects. My goal is to make technological babies for the agency that they safely adopt, right? So they will have requirements, they will have a budget, they will have a timeline, a roadmap for implementation, and they will have insurance that inspector like it, and that operator adopt it, and then member states are not against it. So that's the most important. So I take the risk. I might fail from time to time, but I don't want, once it gets out, that the project fails. So that's one approach. And the second approach, I would say, is for the agency to deal with that is also to master it might sound boring, but to master the administrative rules, because there are so many ways. Procurement is my key playbook here. And there are so many rules for procurement that allows us flexibility, but you need to really know them, and you need to work very closely with procurement to make sure that you have a bit of flexibility. And running projects in an agile way, the way we're doing today, or organizing challenge, crowdsourcing challenge, is actually possible within the administrative rules. And it's surprising, but it works. So there's ways around.
Thanks, that's helpful. Dimitri, we heard in Nidhi's presentation about managing decisions under great uncertainty. In your remarks, you were talking about some of the approaches that the IAEA takes in that same situation. Do you find some of the more innovative approaches that you're taking with your workflows to be somewhat in keeping with the process that Nidhi outlined for how organizations focus on outcomes and problems and conditions instead of just assumptions at the start?
Absolutely. I think what I found fascinating we didn't coordinate that much with Nidhi, but I was happy to see that the keywords and the key topics, robotics and uncertainties, was core to your presentation, because I think that's really the link, and I can't agree more. So I was fascinated to see I would say, very carefully thought and theoretical but practical approach you were presenting. Well, in my case, I was trying to show a more, like I would say, hands-on approach and what we have done things. So I think it was a very good compliment, and I'd be very excited to collaborate with you, Nidhi, in the future to see how we can maybe put more meat around what we are doing here, to explain it better, give more consistency to our approach.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think that I was surprised to see that we are saying the same thing, perhaps at different levels, right, of granularity. And to one thing that really struck me when you described sort of the misnomer of technological foresight, I completely agree, right? It isn't foresight that we are precisely trying to do. We're trying to make near-term decisions that make long-term sense. And that requires a different way of thinking about how we understand our choices and what is going to be a resilient or robust option. How do we manage uncertainty? How do we put safeguards around our experimentation? How do we communicate about risk? So I think the parallels there were striking.
And if I might just complete with a personal note about I would say, my perspective on innovation. I mean, I've been in two completely opposite worlds in my life. On one side, I was building new reactors with the most, I would say, systemic engineering approach, the less flexible way you can do, where each screw, each label has been planned and explained and has been to be justified to the safety operator. And right after this experience, I jumped into creating my own startup. And I was doing the same approach. And after a couple of months of very hard work, I was completely failing because I was producing overheads. I was producing paper and no result, and my cash was decreasing. And when I started, actually for the second time in the agency 7 years ago, I really tried to merge both approach, which is work with a big organization that requires systemic thinking, but inside to inject a bit of lean startup approach.
All right, thanks. We now have plenty of questions coming in from the queue. So I'm going to pose this one to both of you, and whoever feels like they want to take a stab at it first, go for it. The nuclear industry has an issue with public acceptance that is similar to with self-driving vehicles. The public is made aware every time an autonomous vehicle crashes. However, they're not aware of the benefits. How would you go about gaining trust from the public to adopt technology? Nidhi, for you in autonomous vehicles policy, and then Dimitri, for you, perhaps slightly beyond just the safeguards mandate, how do you improve trust in technologies that the agency uses?
I mean, what we're talking about when we're thinking through trust is really we're fighting people's cognitive biases, right? The sort of heuristics people rely on when they say, is this safe? And so it goes back to, you know, why a plane crash will capture people's imagination, make them afraid to fly, even though we have automotive crashes every single day and nobody seems to notice. And so I wish I had an answer, but I actually think that we have to work within people's availability bias, where they think, well, is nuclear security, or sorry, you know, is nuclear safe? We think, well, I remember Chernobyl in 1986. No, it's not, you know, and that stymies almost every advanced technology that has an interplay with safety, because it captures people's imagination in a way that ordinary risks don't. And so this is the field of, you know, cognitive, you know, dealing with cognitive biases, people's mental models. I mean, in climate change, we face this, you know, I work in climate change also, same kind of problem where we have this looming crisis and people can't wrap their heads around it because it's incremental and we don't have that apocalyptic moment, although it seems to be coming. Don't have a good answer there.
Thanks. Dimitri, role of trust.
Well, I mean, trust but verify, right? That's our mantra. So I must say I'm terribly lucky to work for the agency on that, because you know, when I take my phone to reach to new suppliers and I introduce myself, the first reaction, because I don't call many people dealing with nuclear, I call people dealing with technologies, you know, cameras, sensors, but very few dealing with radiation. And the first question is, why are you calling me? You work for IAEA, and I have always a long explanation to explain that's true. We measure, and I explain why we measure, but we use a lot of technologies, and I'm looking for new things that we don't use yet. And the reaction of people is, I mean, we start with a very good image, and that's really lucky, because it makes my work a lot easier. When you are in a startup, just to get this first phone call to exist, it takes years of work. So here I can just, I mean, be admirative of the work of my colleagues outside safeguards, but for the communication departments that have created this very good image of the agency that is doing technical work and that is giving safeguard conclusion based on evidence and not on politics.
If I can respond, I completely agree. You know, the role of institutions, trusted institutions in these kinds of fields is incredibly important. In autonomous vehicles, there is no such institution that has this long history. And I think that's one of the challenges. People don't know who to turn to have that you know, unbiased opinion. And so to have that in the nuclear community is incredibly important, and to not lose that, because once that trust is lost, it's not coming back, or it's very, very difficult to rebuild it. So staying aligned with what people expect a trustworthy institution to do, I think, is incredibly important.
Staying in this thread for just a second, Dimitri, in your talk, you mentioned how niche your market is among member states with specific applications. What about building capacity, awareness, and trust among member states who need to consider innovative technologies for safeguards uses?
Absolutely, and we have a lot of tools already that exist for that. I mean, one of the most useful channels we have are the support programs, which allow us to communicate on a technical basis, communicate on needs to all the states that have this resource in place. So it provides us incredible help. And for my very narrow field of work for technology foresight, I really try to bring new tools for them, new mechanism for us to help us, because you can come up to a member state and say, we need to build 200 of these instruments and we need so much money. Or you can come with a very fuzzy definition of what you need, and all the research and development is made. So that's possible tools. What I'm trying to bring also is, I would say, micro contributions, which is like, just identify, one person that's inside your state that could contribute to our challenge, or just have us facilitate access to a site where we can deploy. And this, when it's done at the early stage of a project, the return on investment is incredibly high. So that's where I would say we can be quite thrifty on the resource we ask, because we ask them early. If you ask them late, then it's big money and big risks.
Thanks. A question from the queue, and we've got about 5 minutes or so left of this panel before we wrap up. So if you have any burning questions, feel free to add them in there and just go upvote things like crazy. And I think that this question is probably best for Nidhi. How does machine learning algorithms, how do they help in making good decisions in the case of nuclear security threats? And forgive the upcoming jargon, but for example, in a case of nuclear material theft, how could a machine learning algorithm help in identifying lost material? The questioner used pulse shape discrimination, which informs me of just how well educated our audience is today.
So I don't know what pulse shape detection is. It really is, what machine learning is able to do is to find patterns that are invisible to the human eye, right? To abstract away from a huge amount of data, to abstract away and understand what are the underlying drivers, what are the underlying features, what can we extract? So for this particular example, I'm afraid I don't know enough to be able to say specifically how nuclear material theft could be managed. But when I think of other applications of machine learning that may or may not have similarities, whether we're talking about human trafficking or drugs or other kinds of things we're trying to find, it really is about taking a large amount of diverse data and using it to find those underlying patterns. The difficulty becomes that machine learning can do what's called overfitting, which means we're learning the wrong things. Learning, for example, that, if one is trying to learn what makes teeth clean, a machine learning algorithm could mistakenly think turning the bathroom light on is what makes teeth clean rather than brushing, because it is finding things in the data that are spuriously correlated with the thing you're trying to detect. And so that is both the opportunity and the challenge, is that you can find patterns that are invisible to the human eye, but you might learn things that have nothing to do with the outcome that you're trying to detect.
That's helpful. Thanks for fielding that. Hang on, I have the pleasure of getting to watch the question queue as it comes in while talking with you. It's a good exercise in multitasking, which I hope a machine learning algorithm is a lot better at it than me. One more question from the queue. So for autonomous vehicles, success would be reducing the number of failures or passenger deaths in that case, I think. For nuclear weapon success would be reducing the probability of a single catastrophic failure. Does this philosophical difference have technical implications?
That is a great question. I'm gonna tie this to this previous question around machine learning or the techniques that you use. Because for a lot of the kinds of methods one wants to use, we need an understanding of cause and consequence, right? And in self-driving, we have, Americans drive some 3 trillion miles a year. That's a lot of miles on the road to be able to understand patterns. When we're talking about a surprise event, that's a different set, that is a different methodology, because instead we are not using, to my understanding, we're not using a huge data set upon which to make inferences, but instead we're using our imagination undergirded by a theory of how this can work to try to imagine where the assumptions underlying nuclear security would fall apart. What would fail such that we then have a catastrophic event? So I think those philosophical differences definitely have trickled down into methodological and technological differences.
Dimitri, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, once more, here at IAEA, we're lucky because we don't have to take real-time decisions. So that means that if we implement machine learning, it's only one element among others to trigger something that will have to be verified through other grid of assessments. So I would say is awareness, definitely interesting, but it won't be the only and single fail-safe criteria that we're going to consider. Where I'm really interested, I would say, on a pure instrument viewpoint, is that many of the instruments I'm developing now are actually gathering a lot of data. Too much data, I would say some, but definitely we need to make something out of it. And I think that in the next 2 years, a lot of the challenge I'm going to launch are going to deal with that. What can we get out of the data? Like the example of the spent fuel, we're generating 30 frames per second, where we had traditionally 1 per fuel assembly. And they will be all tagged, localized. So there is a lot of data we can make of it, and then we can improve the effectiveness. We can see a lot more than what we see today. But once more, it's only one set of criteria that the inspector will use to draw a severe conclusion. And that makes us resilient.
I think we have to leave it there. Our time is up. I've found this to be a lot of fun. I've enjoyed the opportunity to learn from the both of you, and hopefully we get to share this with the broader non-proliferation and nuclear security communities. As I wrap and conclude my role for this event, I want to give a special shout out to some people working behind the scenes, to my colleague Louisa Canassis at the Stanley Center, and to my colleague Dan Johnson at WINS, who've been managing some of the Q&A and trying to keep me on script. And also for our big production team here at the Stanley Center, with Patty Papke, Kate Connell, Eleanor Taft, Heather Maxwell, and many others, including our comms team and Mark Seaman. And hopefully there's like a movie style end credits coming up here, but I probably doubt it. With that, just thank you both again for presenting these insights. I get to sign off now, and hopefully I get to see you soon in person somehow. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. And now handing off to conclusion remarks from Ruth Kipps. Ruth, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. And now that we've come to the end of this webinar, I want to thank the entire workshop team as well, including the staff from the Stanley Center, the INMM California, Pacific Northwest and Southwest chapters, as well as the INMM headquarters, who made it all possible. The webinar team all worked closely together, both here on the virtual stage as well as behind the scenes, to ensure its success. So thank you all. A special thank you goes out, of course, to our speakers, Nidhi and Dimitri. Thank you for joining us today and for sharing your valuable insights on emerging digital tech and the related challenges and opportunities. I think our discussion raised some really good points about acceptable risk, trust, decision-making, and who's ultimately responsible for managing the consequences of deploying emerging technology. And it's interesting to see how those concepts and approaches for innovation are implemented in the nuclear materials management world. So we look forward to exploring these topics more in depth at our in-person event at Lawrence Livermore National Lab next year. Please check out the INMM website, inmm.org, on the events page for more details that are hopefully coming soon. And while you're there, I'd also encourage you to become a member of the INMM to help grow our community and continue the dialogue on these very important topics. Another event that we have on the calendar is the INMM annual meeting, which will be held in Vienna in August next year, where we hope to see many of you again. And then finally, I wanted to thank each and every one of you for taking the time of your busy schedules to join us in this discussion today and sharing your thoughts and questions, because that's ultimately what it's all about, starting a conversation and thinking through some of these challenges. So I hope you found it useful and stimulating, and look forward to continuing the discussion at our in-person event. Until then, I wish you all a great rest of your day or evening, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you for your attention, and hope to see you all soon. Goodbye.